So we can just sort of sit here looking dumb, Tony.
Okay, well, it's not hard for me. I don't know. You're a journalist, aren't you? An investigative journalist, aren't you?
That's what I call myself.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm a Plan B author now.
Okay.
We're all good to go. So thanks everyone who joins in watching today. Just want to introduce Tony Birch to everyone, and I'm also happy that Karina Kilmore is joining us today. So Karina is one of Global Girls Online Book Club's associated authors, and her debut, she's the debut author of Where the Truth Lies. So Tony, for those who don't know, is the author of 3 novels. The best-selling The White Girl, which I've recently just read. Got my copy here to show you that I've read it, and really enjoyed reading it. Have to say, a real eye-opener, I'd say to myself, which I will ask you more about soon. And he's the winner. So The White Girl was the winner of the 2020 New South Wales Premier Award for Indigenous Writing and shortlisted for the 2020 Miles Franklin Literary Prize. Ghost River was the winner of the 2016 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Indigenous Writing, and Blood, which was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award in 2012. He's also the author of Shadowboxing and 3 short story collections, Father's Day, The Promise, and Common People. And in 2017, he was awarded the Patrick White Literary Award. In 2021, he released 2 new books, a poetry collection, Whisper Songs, and a new short story collection, Dark as Last Night. And Tony Birch is also an activist, historian, and essayist. So thanks so much, Tony, for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Before we start, I want to do a really important acknowledgement of country. So I'm in Fitzroy in Melbourne, so I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri Nation, of the Greater Kulin Nation, and it's absolutely vital to pay respect to all Wurundjeri people, and certainly to Wurundjeri elders, but all Wurundjeri people. We need to be reminded, of course, that the sovereign nation of this area are the Wurundjeri, and sovereignty has never been ceded to European occupiers. And I want to extend that acknowledgement to where you're coming from, wherever you are in Australia or any other part of the country or the world, that pay respects to Indigenous people who are the owners of your country also. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
We've got people watching from all around the world. So thank you to all the First Nations people of the land that everyone is on watching from tonight. Yeah.
Yes.
And Tony, I was wondering if you wanted to start off by maybe telling us a little bit about The White Girl.
Yeah, sure. So The White Girl is a novel. It's a story about Aboriginal women. It's a story about the courage of Aboriginal women, and certainly, very importantly, about the love between Aboriginal women. It's based on 2 key characters, Odette Brown, who was an Aboriginal matriarch around the age of 60, and Odette Brown is the sole carer for her granddaughter, Sissy, and Sissy is 13 years of age, and she's a fair-skinned Aboriginal girl, hence playing with the notion of the title, The White Girl. And they live in a town in southeastern Australia, a fictional town called Dean, but a town that is very representative of the experience of many, many Aboriginal people, particularly in the southeastern part of Australia throughout the 20th century. And it's a novel that really spins on the idea of Aboriginal people living under what we'll call a series of infamous so-called Aborigines Acts, but basically legislation that not only controlled the lives of Aboriginal people and their freedom or lack of freedom, but the legislative identity of different Aboriginal people. So not only for people who don't know this history in Australia, coming from outside Australia, but certainly being someone who taught history at Melbourne University for many years and who taught Aboriginal history, there are many, many people in Australia who have no notion of the fact that the first formal caste legislation was introduced in the colony of Victoria in 1886, and that form or various forms of caste legislation were adopted by all Australian states in the Commonwealth in various forms in the 20th century. And by caste, I literally mean that Aboriginal people's legal identity or citizenship or lack of it was divided into blood quantum, biological percentages. And because of those biological percentages, people could be dealt with in very different ways, such as being separated from family. And therefore, to take that dynamic into the township of Dean, it's about what happens when a new policeman, a Sergeant Dean, who's a very officious and quite pathological man, arrives in the town, and he seeks to take greater control of the lives of Aboriginal people and literally targets Sissy as a prize, in a sense, of a child that he takes an interest in. And the rest of the novel, or certainly the second half of the novel, it's about Odette finding ways to escape the attention of that policeman. There are other issues, of course, running through the book in relationship to past violence against Aboriginal people, such as violence against Odette's daughter, Lila. But there are other characters who come into the novel, particularly Aboriginal people, and we get a sense of the sorts of repressive regimes or the repressive lives they've had to deal with.
And I was talking to Karina before. Both of us, we grew up in New Zealand and live in Australia now. It really, really surprised me that how little I knew about Indigenous history. And it wasn't until I moved to Australia and my children went to school and watched Rabbit Proof Fence and some other things like that, that I actually started to learn more about it. And reading your book, I learned even more that I was surprised about. Like I didn't even know about the restrictions of movement and all that as well. So really enjoyed it, and I like learning more and more. Just wondering if you could tell me, and I'm sure there's a lot of other people like me, how we can learn more about Indigenous history.
Yeah, well, look, there's a first point here. It's really disappointing that this history is so little known in the public realm. So, and I certainly don't put the fault at that at anyone, because, you know, information has got to be available, and this history, although it's very widely known amongst Aboriginal people, it's actually not taught in schools. There's a little bit of stuff around, you know, Rabbit Proof Fence and a few other films, for instance. But in fact, what is really saddening is that the experience of Aboriginal people and particularly the governmental legislative frameworks are widely known within bureaucratic circles and certainly widely available. So I think the thing I want to say to everyone, firstly, this is not a secret history. Not that you don't know it, it's because it hasn't been made available in the public realm, but it's not a secret history and it's not difficult to find. The second point that I'd make, which will address your question in some ways, is that one of the reasons I decided to write the book is that when I was working as a historian, I did a lot of work in the Public Records Office in Melbourne, the Victorian Public Records Office, and a place called Australian Archives in Lonsdale Street, and I worked specifically on Aboriginal women's writing. So I was interested in what sort of writing was produced by Aboriginal women on missions and reserves in Victoria throughout the 20th century. Now, by the way, there are other important women scholars, historians who had done work in this area. I was specifically interested in the way that women spoke about family and the way that the domestic became a political environment. Why I'm raising that is it certainly gave me some information that I wanted to explore in the novel, but more importantly, it was testament to how widely available this material was if you just went and looked for it. Again, these are not restrictive documents. They're in the public domain if you go into the archive. So this history should be more well known. I don't want to bore people with it, but people may remember back to the early 2000s when we had this so-called history war in Australia. And I remember the then Prime Minister John Howard said, yeah, we need a history of Australian heroes. And I did facetiously say, and this does bring New Zealand history into it, we could get the New Zealand horse Farlap, who we claim as our own, and put Sir Donald Bradman on its back. So the horse was already stuffed. We could stuff Sir Donald Bradman, put him on the back, and he could be whipping the horse with his cricket bat, and that would be the sort of perfect Australian hero.
Tony, you're bringing up two very sensitive topics.
Yes.
One, horse racing, and two, cricket, underarm bowling, you know, sort of like, what?
So, but more importantly, I did teach my students at the time to say, well, I could show you many heroes. These women, they're all heroes. They kept their families together. They fought governments for survival. And these women are just remarkable, unsung heroes, not only of Aboriginal narrative and history, but I think if you want to say what sort of country do we want to be, or do we want to be a better country, these women would be just remarkable role models. But where do we find more? I think that thankfully there is more and more material being produced by Aboriginal creative workers. So not so much in formal academia, although there is some, so that I think there are great responses to these issues and discussion of these issues in the arts generally. So Aboriginal people, obviously, as with me, working in fiction and poetry, there are remarkable Aboriginal filmmakers out there now doing remarkable films. Certainly in other areas of the theatre. I think Leah Purcell, for instance, her take on The Drover's Wife, both the book, the stage play, and now the film, is a remarkable document of the lives of Aboriginal women. So generally, to answer your question, I'd say that the way that Aboriginal people are responding to this history in Australia is very strongly based in the arts, so that you can really get access to really good material. But I would say that doing a bit of a paper chase or online chase, we're now also being exposed to great access to these histories on the web. I would, though, if I were to point to anyone's remarkable online presence, a very good friend of mine, the Aboriginal activist Gary Foley. Gary Foley's online website is a remarkable repository of primary documents, secondary documents, photographic collections, essays, short films. I was very lucky to work with other Aboriginal people, including Gary Foley at Victorian University for the last 5 years of my academic career. And there is a remarkable archive project there, which is called the Gary Foley Archive. He has a remarkable archive presence, and that all of that material, and I'm talking rooms full of material, has now been digitised and will soon be made available to researchers and scholars. But on his website, his Koori website, there's so much there that you can go to. And it's a really good starting point, because not only do you get access to material he's produced, but he does produce very good links to other scholars. So I think there's enough out there for us now all to be educated, but I would say that, again, one of my disappointments is that a lot of this history still needs to be taught more extensively in schools. So that I've got grandkids now in school. I've had my 5 kids went through high school in the last couple of decades, and we've got to get beyond Aboriginal education being cultural education in a very shallow way. So we still get stuff around Aboriginal food, bush tucker. We get stuff around Aboriginal folk tales. So we get stuff around so-called tradition, but what we need to do is be much more critical of this colonial interaction, because that's the only way we understand where we are and who we are, is to say this colonial history that we've dealt with and lived through, this is all Australians, this is the way we understand who we are as a nation. And in the novel, in The White Girl, what I tried to address is a very simple premise, and to refute it is that to take that history, one of the statements that is often made about Aboriginal women and the theft of Aboriginal children is that Aboriginal women gave their children up to the state willingly, and even the more damning comment that Aboriginal children didn't love their children in the way that white society could. So that's why the novel is not while there's violence on the periphery of this story, it's ever present. The heart of this book, I was determined that I would write a book about love, and a book which is really steeped in tenderness, even down to the physicality. So, it's the physicality between Odette and Sissy, and people talk about the bath scene in the novel, the first bath scene, which was about conveying that physical, tactile relationship between a grandmother washing her granddaughter's hair. And having 4 daughters who I used to bath and wash, is one of those most enjoyable Sunday nights we ever had, and the beauty of being able to wash your kids' hair. And then in the novel, there's another, I think, very telling moment when a younger Aboriginal woman, Wanda, who meets Sissy and Odette in a hotel, and they have a little of an awkward confrontation that is resolved when Odette knows Wanda's history, and Wanda asks the older woman for a hug.
Yeah.
And there's just one paragraph where she grabs hold of the older woman and just savors her whole body. The smell of the older woman, the scent of her body, the touch, the heartbeat on her heartbeat, the warmth of her body. And although that's only one paragraph in the book, it's one of the most important paragraphs in the book. And I have to say, it was the hardest paragraph I've ever written. And it's a paragraph I could never read because I'd just start bawling and you'd all feel sorry for me.
I feel tearful now just recalling the paragraph. Yeah,
and that,
very moving.
And that I would say that to anyone listening tonight, and you know, for Aboriginal people, for Māori, we know this terrible situation that's occurred in Canada recently with the discovery of the bodies of children, but also non-Aboriginal people who have lost their children or whose children have been institutionalised. One of the things that is a terrible common experience of children in institutions is the lack of physical touch, absence of love, and that craving for their mother's bodies. So I wanted to really convey that.
Yeah, I think you do it really beautifully. It stayed with me. It's still with me now, you know, after all this time after reading it. But I'm really interested also to know, Tony, what people do you identify with?
Oh, sorry. So I've lived my whole life in Melbourne, so that I was born here in Fitzroy, so I haven't even left the suburb yet. So we have a friend of mine, Destiny Deacon, who's an Aboriginal artist in Melbourne, as a collective, and this is because we all grew up in the inner city we all grew up in the inner city of Melbourne, but we all came from somewhere else. So our families moved to the city or moved to Melbourne from usually about the 1940s, but my family situation is quite peculiar in the sense that my family on both sides moved to Melbourne in around 1900. So in a contemporary sense, we like to call ourselves Fitzroy Blacks, which is both a reality of our experience, but also it's making a political statement. Regardless of the country that we came from and when we came from, we also have an absolute affinity to this place, and this is our common identity. So what it is about growing up in Fitzroy in the post-war to the, say, 50s or 60s, the real important issue is that's what makes us, that's who we are. But my family's situation is really interesting, so that on my dad's side, what we call the patriarch of our family is actually a man called Prince Moody, who was from Barbados. So he came from Barbados to what was then called Van Diemen's Land, married an Aboriginal woman, Annie, and then they had a son called James, and then they moved to Melbourne. So my dad's side of the family is in fact Aboriginal from Tasmania and West Indian or from Barbados. And on my grandmother's side, really sadly, that my grandmother's was taken from her Aboriginal mother at a very young age and given away to a hotel owner in a place called Bigport in northwestern Tasmania. He was then at the 18 months of age given a baptism certificate in the name of the pub owner, who never formally had to adopt her, and her mother, who had no birth certificate, was placed as an adult woman in an asylum where she spent the rest of her life. So my grandmother never saw her mother again. And the treatment of my grandmother was so shocking in this white family that at the age of 12, she ran away, and she got on I don't know how she did it, she got on a boat and she came to Melbourne. So she was a 12-year-old girl on her own in Melbourne, and ended up spending time in prison for an offence. And then she also moved to Fitzroy and was integrated into that Aboriginal community. And one of the issues that I'm so proud of this history is that a good friend of mine, Kim Kruger, an Aboriginal artist in Melbourne, went through a similar experience of me of displacement, why we're so while we're so passionate about that Fitzroy life and not try to reinvent ourselves as some sort of, essential sort of noble Aboriginal person to satisfy mostly non-Aboriginal people, is that she says beautifully that the reason we're Aboriginal people is we made ourselves Aboriginal people. In other words, we accepted ourselves and reformed the community. So the Fitzroy community is really what's called a historic community, not a tribal or traditional community. It's a little, people know the experience of the First Nations, the Métis in Canada. It's very similar. So I've met Métis people who are very vibrant urban communities in Canada, really strong urban communities, but who have, some of them, we don't have the same problem. Some of them have no official affiliation or government recognition because they don't fit a particular blood quantum or what you might call tribal grouping. So we certainly don't suffer that here. So our strength really is in being such a tight-knit community in the city of Melbourne.
And I mean, also, you have so many achievements and so many titles and acknowledgements. I've just made a little list: author, professor, multi-award winner, curator, teacher, activist. What's your most important title? What's your most important recognition? What makes your heart sing?
To be honest, grandfather. I haven't done all those things at once, by the way, so that I no longer work as an academic. I retired from academia last year, or I stopped being an academic. Look, I've got a new book of stories out called Dark as Last Night, and it's not some people who know me or know that book. I had a really terrible experience of a really sudden death of my younger brother 2 years ago, and it did disable me for a while and changed what I thought I should do, not sort of in some dramatic way, but I felt that, my grandkids were at an age where they needed some care. As anyone here and tonight, parents know the horrific cost of childcare. So I thought I could help my daughter financially by doing some childcare. I just wanted to spend more time with my grandkids rather than just see them occasionally. So I decided a year ago I'd finish up work. I had been caring for them anyway before that. So the most important issues to me are being, just to be a really responsible person in my family is the most important thing. I was doing an interview for Radio National today on the new book, and the title story, Dark as Last Night, is a story about family violence and the courage of a girl to defy that, which is a theme that I've dealt with in several of my books, because I come from a family where family violence was, I have to tell you, coming from New Zealand, I remember when I saw Once for Warriors, someone said, did you like the movie? I said, well, it was like a home movie, It wasn't a feature film.
It wasn't fiction.
No, it was a home movie. So you'd know the sort of story I'm talking about. And so that in my fiction, I've tried to deal with the hypocrisies of secrecy, the cowardice of male violence. I mean, when I say cowardice, I'm talking about the confusion of a boy growing up amongst men who are very strong, like physical men, and have all these so-called rules about, you never kick a man when he's down, never fight someone smaller than yourself, all these things that they talk about, but you would see men beating up women and just think, well, that doesn't seem to sit with what you just said. And so I've tried to deal with male violence in a way that's both honest, but also to change those attitudes. But the reason I say that is that I'm very aware that as a man, and a man with four daughters, I have a lovely son and a lovely granddaughter, that I need to be aware of my responsibilities as a man, of how I behave in my family, so that it's really important to me that that's my priority. So a really good example would be during COVID. We know that people are dealing with a lot of anxiety and, people, dealing with, issues around their mental health. I need to make sure I spend time, like I went for a lovely walk with one of my daughters today. I'll have my grandson here on Thursday. So that's my priority, my family, and that's what I need to be best at. And it's not a sacrifice, because if I wasn't best at that, the other things I like to do wouldn't function. So, my daughter Grace always, that terrible line, you're only as happy as your unhappiest child. So you should never have five, by the way. But because when I know my kids are doing well, and I feel more content. So in that sense, my writing I'm doing as much writing as I want to do. I'm really sort of content in myself. So I would say, being a good person in the family, then being a good person in the community, and that means certainly in the Aboriginal community and the wider community around issues. I'm really invested in issues around climate justice.
Yeah.
Secondly, that my writing is always as good as it can be. So I really like to write and hope I produce my best work. And the third one is the only thing I've done near as long as reading this is going to annoy people, is running. My running is so important to me that if I didn't run, I wouldn't write. So I've been running for about 45 years, and it's like my day starts with a thinking about where am I going to run that day, which means you're also obsessed with the weather, by the way. So my interests are fairly simple, but I think that it's about making sure you're well-centered so that everything else can work well. I used to, by the way, this is something, I taught creative writing for 12 or 13 years, and the things that I would teach might seem like the things you don't need to teach. It would be these sorts of things.
Yeah.
I would say to students in the first week, I would say, why are you writing? Why are you writing? Can you give me one word to describe what it is that says this is why I write? What is your ethics around writing? And they would never know what their ethics were. And I'd say writing is a real privilege in a positive way, not privilege in the negative.
Yeah.
Writing is such a privilege. It's such a treasure to be able to write. And I would say to them, if people ask me what's the greatest experience of being a writer, it's talking to a reader. You go to read, like this is an online event. I love going to local libraries and you talk to, usually 12 women and one bloke. And they're really unbelievably invested readers. They know books so well, and you get to sit with people for an hour who talk about your work. That's the best part of being a writer. And then I used to say, well, therefore, to be a writer, I think is to be really responsible to writing, really responsible to your readers, and you need to have an ethical statement that guides you. So I think those sort of what we might call those psychological aspects of being a writer, when we work with young writers and new writers, those things are never put in place. And I actually think young writers will be really helped by knowing why they're writing, who they're writing for, and what are the values of writing. And if we taught that more, I think those, when I say kids, younger people, I think they would start off with their work would be of a better quality sooner, I think, because they would really put a different value on what they're doing.
And that's really interesting that you say that you also had a career teaching writing, because like me, you dropped out of school very, very young, and then you went back to education to become an educator.
Yeah, and I think that was sort of, well, not by accident. So I got expelled from two high school, Richmond High School, where you live, down Hynes Street. Oh, somewhere in Richmond, sorry. Richmond High School and Princess Hill High School in the 1 year, which is not easy to do.
That's a record.
Well, probably not. It's in the inner city of Melbourne in the 70s, but it's not bad. And I think there are a couple of things here, though, to say about what it is that interests you as a writer. I've written about this before, and it might seem again odd, is that when I was 21, I actually was very lucky. I joined the fire brigade. And when I got to about 27 or 28, I really realised that I had buggered up school, and it was my fault. Rather than sort of boast about being a bad boy, I'd actually been an idiot and really buggered up school. So I decided to go back to school and did what was romantically called night school. And I had been running for a few years, and the same year I went back to night school, I decided to run a marathon. And I did it really meticulously in the sense I had a program, a weekly program that started on the 1st of January 1986, I think, to how many miles or kilometres I needed to run each week, so that when I ran the marathon in October, I would not only run well, but I wouldn't die. People run marathons. If you ever want to see people who could put you off sport for life, go to an amateur marathon event, and you see people coming in 4.5 hours, and they look like they're going to die. And I thought, I don't want to look like that. I want to look like at least I've enjoyed it. So that required a lot of really serious and meticulous training. And then when I went to night school, I thought, that's what I have to do. I have to apply order, and I have to make sure I'm prepared to do the work. And that sense of a method, which is work, labour intensive, I've always taken to my writing. And one of the things I've been, again, impressed upon students, or if I do an occasional workshop, is to say, I love interviews with writers, not where writers tell you how to write. They usually don't work. The Paris Review Journal runs these beautiful, historically, from about 1950s, these lovely long essays with writers, essays of about 20 pages usually, quite in-depth. And what you learn, so I've read, again, if my daughter was in the room, she'd say, look, he's just OCD, just ignore him, What I learned by reading every interview in the Paris Review over the years is that writers, we are very idiosyncratic. We have very different things that we do and approaches. So you might say, oh, Tony, have you tried this idea? And I think, well, it doesn't work. It means it doesn't work for me. It wouldn't dare say that it didn't work for you. But I always said to my students, if there's two things that I learned from reading all those interviews, one, there are two commonalities. One is that all writers who are successful that I've ever read about regard what they do as work. They don't regard it as romance or something they do in an attic, or they have a very labour approach to their writing, very strict. So when they say, they always begin by asking questions, where do you work and how do you work? And they know that back to front. They know where they work best, how they work best, how their day is broken up. And some writers might write 8 hours a day and some write 3, but the point is both of those writers know what works for them. So I always say to students, know how you work and when you work best, and become a worker with your writing. But the second one, it goes to what you said, it's about the combination of learning and teaching, because I think about one of the great things about being a writer is that it's really interesting because both by reading and by writing your drafts, you are learning and teaching yourself simultaneously. So you perform both roles. So I think that being an educator for me became really something that I loved, because I had taught history at university, and when the offer came to teach writing, and a lot of people thought it was a bit of a backward step, because historians are the aristocracy of the humanities. I actually thought, no, teaching writing is a great way to teach, because I will be learning and teaching. And I learned a lot, by the way. I've learned so much by teaching students from those students. And if you're ever in a group like your group tonight, or if I'm sitting with another, I love hanging out with writers where you just talk about what you're doing. I mean, you mightn't go in depth about what you're doing because of that superstition, but a great mate of mine, the writer Arnold Zabel, often,
I love him.
If we have lunch and we talk about our work, Arnold might say, oh, I had this idea and I wasn't sure how to deal with it. And he'll tell you, Arnold will always tell you a story about how he got to turn an idea into a piece of work. And what you feel as another writer, you're being taught. It's not to say, oh yeah, I should do what Arnold is doing, although sometimes that advice is really helpful. But what you're learning is, here's someone trying to discover the way out of a problem, and the way out of that problem is to be curious, to search, etc. And so that it's a great discipline to always be learning about, and always be, I think the great thing of being a writer is that I'm always reaching for, like, I'm a sucker for a good review, and I'll see a review of a book and I think, okay, I've got to read that, not only because the writer might interest you or the work, but there's something in that can help me and teach me something.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention as well, we do have a lot of people watching, and thanks to you, QP, if someone asks a question, they'll have a chance to win a copy of your Dark as Last Night book. So I've got a few questions.
It's a great book.
Yeah, it is.
I've got that one to read, but I haven't quite read that one. But after you gave the description, it sounds like another one I'm definitely going to have to put up close to my list. Mary Lou's wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the research you've done into climate change.
Oh, yeah. So people mistakenly think writing is a job. It's not. The other thing I tell my students, if you want to enjoy your writing, get a paid job that you don't get anxiety for. Just to brief background, I went back to university in 1988, did an undergrad degree, did a MA in creative writing, and did a PhD in history, and started teaching history at Melbourne University in about 1996. I moved to the creative writing program in 2002. In 2014, I was invited to be part of a global project, was to work with 15-year-old kids in producing creative responses to the climate crisis that we were facing. And I worked with kids in Melbourne, London, Dublin, Gdansk, and Berlin. So I went and visited those places and worked in those schools. It was a remarkable opportunity. And I realised after doing that project that the climate issue and the ability to respond as a writer and respond as someone interested in, creative responses amongst the community, I wanted to do more work. So I was very lucky at middle of 2015, I was offered a professorial fellowship at Victoria University in Melbourne in the Moondarney Balak Aboriginal Centre. So for 5 years until the end of June last year, I worked basically in the broad area of climate change and how we communicate ideas. I did work around climate justice and its impact on marginalised communities and Indigenous communities in Australia and globally. And I also worked on what we call traditional ecological knowledge, which was about Indigenous responses to changing ecologies and environments that would be beneficial to the wider community. So it was a 5-year research job. I lectured, luckily, and gave what are called papers, conference presentations in Australia and globally. So I did a lot of work in Japan, actually, where there's a really strong interest in the work. And I published a lot. So, I mean, if anyone's interested, they can look up my name and just put in climate change, and the academic work that I did should come up. So some of it is more academic, for want of a better word. Some of it is more in the essay form. But it is interesting that it morphed into, toward the end of the project, and what I've done since, I did a series of, for want of a better word, a walking essays. So essays where I talked about walking practice and its relationship to an appreciation for locality. Just off the top of my head, if people have a bit of paper, if you were to put into Google Tony Birch and Meanjin, that's MEANJIN, which is a journal, there are 2 essays. One is called Walking and Being, and the other one is called Two Fires. And those essays in particular I'm really proud of, which are about trying to write what you might call personal narratives in relationship to place and its relationship to climate. So I suppose to be more direct about it, I'm interested in the impact of climate on people in their own place. So that when I talk kids in Dublin, rather than talk about it as a global crisis, I got them to write about their love of a pony paddock at the end of a housing estate and how they would feel if they lost that pony paddock due to some dramatic weather event. Because these kids knew all about the terrible Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria. They knew a lot about global disasters, but they didn't have any sense of, the future of climate change means that any community could be impacted upon in a negative way. So I got kids to think about their place. So in Melbourne, because I worked with a school in the western suburbs called Footscray City College, that school sits just above the Maribyrnong River. I got them to think about their river and protecting their river. So it was about getting young people to think about their own place as a place to love and protect. And a lot of these kids were poorer kids, marginalised kids. And I just use the analogy to say, and people know my work, I've written a lot about the Birrarung, the Yarra River. I love that river. And, when I was a 15-year-old juvenile delinquent, I never would have turned to one of my best mates and said, I love the river. They would have just punched you in the arm or something. And I said to the kids, look, I know, some of these kids were big, tough kids. I said, if you love this place, it doesn't hurt to say it. And it was about getting them to understand that it's okay to say you love a place.
I'm really interested to know, when you were growing up and like a teenager, did you think you would ever be in like where you are now, or what were your aspirations when you were a teenager?
I love that question. I never had any aspirations. And when you have none, you can't fail. It sounds odd, but when I went to university and you see young kids from private schools and you think, you shouldn't be sympathetic to these kids. They're from really rich families, or some of them are. But the enormous pressure, the pressure of their life, their parents have great expectations because they've paid a lot of money. And you find the aspirations of these kids come with a really strongly associated sense of fear, because if they fail, they really feel that they've failed their family. So I didn't have any aspirations. My aspirations were, at 15, were to go for a swim in the river and learn to blow the perfect smoke ring. I mean, it wasn't much more than that. People had aspirations for me, though, because I remember when I taught at Melbourne University, within the space of 1 week teaching creative writing, I taught a mature age student, and he said, I'm married to a Greek Australian who went to Richmond High School in the early 70s. And I just thought, oh no, I don't like where this is going. My wife said she knew a Tony Birch and she said, can you ask if you're the same Tony Birch? And I said, yeah, that's me. And she said, oh yeah, because my wife thought you would be in prison. And another girl I taught, her grandmother taught me English very badly, and I was a bad student. And she said, my grandmother didn't believe in miracles until I told her that you were teaching me. So, so people had aspirations for me. To be more serious about it, I think the best way to answer the question is, I certainly didn't have any of those aspirations, but the two things that were important is I was a voracious reader. And I've talked to this and written about this. I got my first library card when I was 6, and I've still got a public library card. And we didn't have books in our house, literally couldn't afford books, but I love borrowing books. I've always read. I don't go anywhere still without a fiction book in my bag or in my pocket. So even though I'd fallen out of school, when I went back to night school in my late 20s, I realised, because I read so much, and also I read a lot of newspapers and magazines, politics and stuff, I was really well equipped to go back to study, much better than I thought I had. And the other issue, I suppose, which is relevant, when I did start to write fiction, and people are holding out for hope for your first novel. I didn't publish my first book till I was 49. So I was over the hill. And one of the things that I would say is that I do come from a tradition of really great storytelling. So telling stories around the kitchen table was just what we grew up doing. And I know some great storytellers who've never written a word, a published word. And I really do think that I am a good storyteller, and I think that it comes out, and I mean this orally, because I think I learned by being amongst storytellers, growing up amongst storytellers, you really actually learn about plot and pace and character and tone and drama. And I think because it's performed, in other words, whether it be around a kitchen table, in the schoolyard, at your workplace, again, these kids hanging around down the river. There's that great film called Stand By Me, which is based on a Stephen King story. Those kids, when they're walking along that railway track, it to me was like, again, something I knew so well. These kids swapping stories and, telling great stories. I grew up with that as part of my DNA, so that when I started to write fiction, I didn't consciously think back, oh, how do I do it? Because that's how I did it orally. I think I had been teaching myself, except to say when I was thinking about my first book, Shadowboxing, which was published in 2006, I actually did write down, I think it was 10 key words of writing down the key words of stories that I'd grown up hearing, and I decided to write down the stories that I thought were the best stories or the strongest that I myself had told or experienced or that had been told to me. So all the stories based in my first book are based on oral stories that I'd told or heard as a kid.
No, that's really interesting.
And that leads us to your latest collection, Tony. What's the inspiration for those stories?
Well, I think that there was a sort of some strange alignments that I'd been published. So I did The White Girl, and people often forget the time lag. So The White Girl came out in 2019. I probably finished it in 2017, and then you're doing your edits and stuff like that. I'd always written short stories, so I think after The White Girl, I'd probably written about 5 or 6 stories and had most of them published in magazines, which no one reads, or very few of us read. And then, this might surprise people, I had some notes for other stories, but the rest of those stories came in a real burst from last March, so it's now about 15 months ago when we went into that first lockdown, and I did have a real strong creative period. Unfortunately, part of that, so there are 3 stories in the new collection which are dedicated to my younger brother who passed away, and they are about our experience. So I felt a need to write those stories, and I was also very uncomfortable initially about writing those stories, but I'm happy that I did. I'm satisfied with the outcome. And then this strange, and this is another connection for you two. So I had done some work on some poetry, and I'd done a project on water poems for an organisation in Sydney called Red Room Poetry. And Annie Tafu, who's an Australian-born Māori woman who I'd met at a festival and we really clicked, she became the editor of my poetry collection, Whisper Songs. And we were talking about the work, and she's a poet as well, and she was working on a poem called Dark as Last Night. And I said, oh, can you send it to me? And when she sent me the poem, it's a very different poem than my story, but that title of the poem, it was like it captured everything I wanted this collection to be. So what happened then is I wrote the title story, which was quite long, and then it really set the tone and the mood for this rush of stories that came. And then, of course, when I thought about the title of the story and the title of the collection, I thought, well, the obvious title is this title, Dark as Last Night. But then I thought, well, I can't have that title because it's the title of a published poem. And then I spoke to Annie and said, look, this poem has been so influential on the work. If you hadn't published, that poem would be great as the title for my collection. And she said, well, why don't you use it? And I was so indebted to her. I mean, the poem's published, so it's really good to be able to direct people to the poem. So I'm doing a masterclass writing workshop for the Radio National next weekend for their big weekend of books.
Yep.
So when we had a discussion about talking about my book, we were able to say, well, okay, well, it comes out of the influence of this poem. We want to talk about the poem in the interview and make sure that poem is put on the ABC website. So you always want to make sure that when you're being gifted with an idea like that, that you pay due respect to the author. So I'm incredibly eternally grateful to her support, both as an editor and someone who produced such remarkable work. So the collection, I suppose it's like all of my work in that I think it's some of the stories, deal with difficult issues or darker issues. Some of the stories I think are really funny, but generally my books do get, I'm really lucky, my books are generally really well reviewed, but some people even like them, they'll say, oh, he like, I'm always dealing with people who are suffering, or that, I'm always dealing with a sort of miserable end of life. And I don't accept that. I actually accept that, I don't know people whose lives are just continually joyous.
Yeah.
Life is difficult.
Right. Yeah.
And whether you've got money or don't have money, whether you're happily married or single or whatever you are, whether you've got kids or not, you have great moments of joy in your life and you have great moments of difficulty. And for me, that's the issue. And people misunderstand. So if I write a story that part of it might be about family violence, I've written stories about family violence that also show great joy in the lives of those children. And people might find that really puzzling.
Yeah.
When you grow up in a situation where you are faced with that difficulty, as a child, your resilience equips you with the ability to also find joy. It might seem odd to find love. So as much as I knew that, in my personal life, that my father was a very violent person, my childhood was also incredibly happy at times. My grandmother lived next door. My mum was a rock. My oldest sister's like she's just like my guardian angel in the street, and really tough but beautiful, my older sister. So when I look back at my childhood, when I write about that period or contemporary stories, I tend to write stories where people, they do have to face difficulty, and that difficulty makes them stronger. Yeah. So that's what I want to shine a light on people's difficulties, and also on, I've written stories that the central characters. I've written a few stories where central characters are homeless, and again, you could be romantic about homelessness, but it's not. I'm not a stranger to it. My dad lived on the streets for some years, and he's always lived marginally. Is that I always think that if we're going to walk by people in the street who don't even have a roof over their head, we should know their name and we should know their story. And if we do that, maybe we'll be more responsible for our actions. So I like to write about people who are otherwise ignored.
No, that's great. One last question I'll just ask from one of our members. So Paula said you've certainly packed a lot into your life already. What are your next plans?
That's a really good question. So I don't know, I'm probably build a rocket ship or something. Well, I can tell you they won't involve science or maths. I'm not good at that. Look, it is. I mean, it's a good question to finish on, because I think that just on writing, I always, my favourite footballer, Eddie Betts from Carlton Football Club, which will mean something to some people and nothing to other people, announced his retirement today. He's an Aboriginal footballer. He played 350 games. He's a great man. I know him a little bit. He's a great advocate calling out racism in Australia, but just a really gentle man as well. And someone said to me, "Oh, you're glad he's retiring," because there was this idea he would go on. And I said, I'd rather him retire this year on a high than sort of go 1 year too many and, get benched or playing in the seconds and it ends sort of badly. So I often think about my writing. Part of me thinks, I don't know how long I want to write for, because I don't want to write for the sake of it. If I'm not writing in ways that I'm really happy with, that maybe is challenging myself, that readers still enjoy the work, I wouldn't write just for the sake of continue to be published. So I'm a bit aware of that, so that I don't think like my next book will be my last book, but I need to think about, how long would I write for, and to be really content with that. It's better to not write than to write something that is just, banal or meaningless. So I'm a bit conscious of that. I'm not concerned about it. it also runs concurrently with my running. Because I'm a bit OCD, I know how many, I know my best 5K times from when I was 21 till today. And unfortunately, as you get to about 50, your kilometre pace can drop by about a minute every 5 years. So I'm running 6 kilometre pace at the moment for a 7K, which is pretty good. So I do wonder, when I'm 70, does that mean I'll be running an 8 kilometre a minute pace? Am I happy with that? So with my running, I also think, when would I stop that? And I don't think I'll stop tomorrow, but I wouldn't want to be running around sort of with broken knees and busted knees. So I'm thinking of things that I stop. But to really be serious with the reader, I would hope I could ride as long as my riding is interesting. More importantly, what I said before, I hope I'm productive in my family and valued. And the other thing, I think what COVID has taught me is that how much socialization matters. So to be isolated from each other is not a good thing. So because I've retired from day work, I think once we can do it and we're out of COVID, I do want to think about what we, for want of a better term, might be some sort of volunteer activity. I want to still be part of a community other than just a community of friends. So in other words, I would like to think I can do something that is helpful to the community, whether that be teaching, writing on a voluntary basis, whether that be doing something else, or something around climate stuff. By the way, I'm just about to join the board of SEED, which is the Indigenous Youth Climate Alliance. So I'll be doing that work. So I think it would be in thinking that I can be useful in the community. And the other thing is really simple, just to make sure I keep reading and valuing others. And I think the way to finish what we've done is to say this, that I did a conversation for one of the ABC radio shows, which was, I think it was on last week, might have even been this week, with a younger Aboriginal writer, Evelyn Araluen, who's just brought out her first poetry collection, Drop Bear. Evelyn is also the co-editor of Overland Literary Magazine. And I think that as an older Aboriginal person is that what your role is in your community is not to be, because there's a sense in our community where people will automatically give you respect and maybe give you too much authority. My thoughts are to not have that. I would never want a younger Aboriginal person deferring to me. I've got to earn that respect and earn that responsibility of a relationship. But I think that when I did the interview with Evelyn, I said the great pleasure for me was the pleasure to work with someone who's doing remarkable poetry, who worked so hard to put that collection together, and that whatever my role is in that, because I mentored her putting that book together, was to be helpful to her. So I suppose within the Aboriginal community, I hope I can do stuff that's helpful to younger Aboriginal people without ever trying to be some sort of stern uncle, which I really loathe. I always, when I'm talking to young groups, I always say never listen to a baby boomer, and I believe that. And then I always say, unless it's me.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been really, really interesting. I've had one of the members say that this is the most interesting author that they've seen in our group. So,
wow.
Only one of them. Come on. No, look, I just want to say thank you. I did say that I love talking to readers, and I love being in a community of people who love books. It's everything else about being a writer is some of it's okay, some of it's not, but being with readers is the only thing that matters. That's the best part of it. So I really feel privileged to join in, and I'm happy to join in again any time after I've read Where the Truth Lies.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure having you, Tony. And I say the same thing. I wouldn't write at all if people weren't going to read it. You know, I don't write for myself. You know,
No.
I write for people to read
Yep.
my story. Yeah.
There is a wonderful furniture maker in Melbourne called Damien Wright, who's a good friend of mine. And we go back a long way. We did honours together in 1991. And he gave up academia to make furniture. And he makes beautiful furniture, like beautiful. And one of the things we've talked about, this is a beautiful analogy to end on. What you just said, yeah, you write for readers, you want to be read. And the way that we talked about it would be, he makes beautiful tables and chairs out of beautiful ancient timbers. And I always said it would be, when I explained it to him, I said, Damien, you've just made this beautiful table. And what happens to tables? People talk around them, they have their dinner.
Yeah.
I said, to not be read is like someone having made a table that no one ever sits at. And that's why it is so important to be in a community of readers. So thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to everyone who joined in and the questions that people asked. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
See you later.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you in Richmond.
Yeah.